and was being beaten about by the winds and the waves. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus simply said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was blowing and the waves were large, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, truly you are the Son of God." The word from the Lord in the house. I'm going to preface my remarks a little bit. Someone asked about the third candle up here. We received a peace candle from a church in Iowa, and they asked us to light it, and as we did, to pray for peace. So each Sunday, as we light the third candle, it reminds me, hopefully reminds some of you, hopefully now on all of you, to in your heart pray for peace, a peace that seems to be so far away from what we expect now. But it's simply something that we do, and we've sent peace candles on to 3 other churches with the hope that they too have sent some on to other churches, and there's a constant prayer for peace. And I don't mean just the absence of conflict, but the peace in your heart that comes from being loved and held close. The peace that Joseph didn't know in his lifetime, because he was a pain to his brothers. I had 3 older brothers. I can imagine what 10 older brothers would be like. Joseph was the first son of Rachel. The other 10 boys had been born of Leah. And you remember the story of the second choice wife and all that kind of stuff. So they were bonded pretty much because they had the same mother and Joseph didn't. But when Joseph was born to Jacob's favorite wife, he doted on him and he gave him everything, including, as we know, the coat of many colors, which Dolly Parton wrote a song about, and they made a musical about, and so forth. But the problem with the boys was that they felt left out. They didn't understand the broad scope of the love that God had, not just for Joseph, who was especially loved by his father, but especially loved by his mother, but rather that they were all loved equally. But I don't know about your family, but in our family, it never looked quite like it was equal. If you ask my older siblings, I was so spoiled that you couldn't stand me. I also came along a little later because they were clumped and I was later. Whatever. I never tried to understand exactly, but the feeling of antagonism, they got to do things I wanted to do, but they were older, so it made sense, except not to me. And I got to do things that they didn't get to do at my age because they were older and now times had changed. My mother had gotten a little older and a little more lenient and a little more lax and maybe even a little more tired. And I did want to cause her a lot of problems, and I did. And so I understand the antagonism, but the hate that had built up, or the resentment had built up to the point where it erupted, much like some of the demonstrations we see in our day now. That we've let our obsession with being hateful lead us into actions that simply intensify that. And that's what the danger, that's what the problem is in our relationships with each other, whether it's 10 brothers and a younger brother, or it's people with some different ideas, and people who want to, they say, maintain the history of the South, as opposed to doing away with all the symbols of hatred at that time. So why we hate, why we disagree, doesn't make much difference. Because if we haven't got a good reason to do it, we'll make one up. Peter saw Jesus walking to him across the water. And he said, if you call me, I'll come. If you call me, I'll come. Paul's letter to the church in the Romans said, how will they hear it if they don't believe unless someone brings them the word? How would Peter know that Christ could walk on the water if he didn't see him? You wouldn't believe that someone could walk on the water unless you saw it. But you can't walk on the water unless you get out of the boat. You can't fish the deep waters with your boat on the trailer behind your pickup. You have to take some chances. You have to give in to the need to try things, to do things. Unless someone comes with the word, how is the uneducated, how is the non-believer ever going to have a chance to know how to believe? I've never walked on water. I've tried to do some things that I didn't think I could do, and most of the time I was right. Once in a while I was wrong. I didn't think I could be a preacher. And that's why I turned him down several times before he finally convinced me that someone has to bring the word, so that those who need to be reassured, it can be reassured. Those who need to be taught can be taught. Those who need to know for the first time can find out. But Jesus simply said to Peter, come, take a chance. Try it. And he says that to each one of us every day of our life. Not to necessarily take that big a risk, but take the risk of exposing yourself and your belief to those around you. How can we go around in life being morose and sad and convince people we're Christian? Because if that's our attitude, there's no joyful reason to be a Christian. There's no joyful reason to have a relationship with Christ. If all we can do is talk about, well, he failed because he died. No, he didn't fail because he lives. He didn't fail because he took my transgressions that my mother hadn't even thought about yet and took care of them. It's a wonder that he invites us to get out of the boat and take a chance. It's a wonder that he cares enough about us. The brothers threw Joseph in a cistern, a place to collect water, and in the rainy season it would have filled up. This wasn't the rainy season, so it was empty, but if there were rains coming, he would have been condemned to death in that cistern. He also would have been condemned to death if there was no water, because he would have soon starved to death. But Reuben, the oldest one, said, don't shed his blood, because shedding the blood of a brother was an unforgivable sin. So he didn't want them to, quote, kill him. He argued with them. He even thought about, well, I'll go back when they're asleep and I'll get him out of the cistern and I'll let him go. But can you imagine that family if he went back and said, Dad, you should have seen what my brothers did to me. We had this big fun thing, they let me down in the cistern and then they pulled me out. Yeah. I don't think that's the story that Jacob would have got. And yet it's a story that is lived out in the escape from the famine and in the resurrection of the family as a whole, as we read later on as Joseph became the power of Egypt. He became the power of Egypt because oftentimes he took a step forward. Someone had a dream and said, I don't know what it means, and he told him. He could have just kept quiet and served his life sentence. He went to Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife put the moves on him, and he got out of there fast enough that he left his coat. So when Potiphar came home, his wife said, Joseph did it. So they put him back in prison, waiting to be put to death. And was rescued because of the circumstances that God puts into our lives. Each one of us will run into situations where our life will be saved because God put the coincidences, the occurrences into the proper order for things to happen. Now, I don't mean that we're going to be put in prison and saved because you could interpret dreams. That's not part of my story. It may be part of yours. But it's simply the fact that every day we face things in our life that give us an opportunity to serve God. I could say something here that I can't say in the second service because she'll be here. But you imagine it because you got a better imagination even than I do. But every day, every time you interact with each other, you have a chance to demonstrate the love that Christ has given to you. And it's a given in our own households. It's a given that we will demonstrate our love for each other. But how do we do that and make it meaningful? How do we express the love of Christ to those whom we physically love as well? That's a tough equation to figure out. How do you convince your spouse that you're in love with them? How do you convince your spouse that they're special because Christ loves you? How do you convince your spouse that you're not just doing what a spouse ought to do? And if you have to convince them, you probably can't. But it's the little things we do. I can go back to our beginning of our time and say I learned how to hang up my pants on a hanger. Doorknobs used to be a lot more convenient. And now I do it almost every time. But I don't do it often enough so that when I don't do it, she notices that I do it sometimes. I ain't going to say that in the next service. Not even. Joseph's brothers hated him, not because he was him, but because they felt isolated from their father. And he was the source of that isolation. We manufacture barriers to love in our life. We are unwilling to forgive slights of people who hurt us who don't even know they hurt us. And they continue to hurt us because we're never going to forget that they hurt us. And they didn't even know they did it. So who's getting even with who? Peter, come. And until Peter quit focusing on Christ and started focusing on the world, he was doing really well. But when the world became more important to him than Christ, he sank in the lake. And only Christ could rescue him. He says to you, this day, come. Focus on me. Focus on Christ. That you don't have to worry about drowning in the stuff of the world around you. He says to you, come. Will you? Amen. We're going to sing, Here I Am, Lord. 593, and you stand with me if you can.